Welcome to After Dark Horrors. I'm your narrator, and if you're new here, you've just stepped into the darkest corner of the internet where real terror lives. Every week, we dive deep into authentic encounters that defy explanation, stories that will follow you long after you turn off the lights. Tonight's collection comes from hospital security footage, employee testimonies, and archived incident reports that were never meant to reach the public. These aren't stories from fiction writers or urban legend enthusiasts. These are documented encounters from real hospital staff caught on real surveillance systems in real medical facilities across the country. Before we begin, I need to warn you, what you're about to hear involves some of the most disturbing encounters ever recorded in hospital basement environments. If you're easily unsettled by medical facilities, unexpected encounters, or situations involving vulnerable people, you might want to consider watching something else tonight. For those brave enough to continue, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. These stories don't come easy, and your support helps us bring you more authentic horror every single week. Now, let's descend into the basement levels where healing ends and something else begins. Story 1. The Night Shift Visitors. Catherine's General Hospital, Portland, Oregon, September 2023. The first story comes from Marcus Webb, a night security guard who worked at St. Catherine's General Hospital in Portland for 7 years. Marcus reached out to me last month with footage and documentation that his former employer definitely doesn't want public. Here's what he told me in his own words. My shift started at 11 p.m. every night, Sunday through Thursday. St. Catherine's is a 400-bed facility, and during night hours, it's mostly empty except for the ICU, emergency department, and a skeleton crew of nurses and doctors. The basement level houses the morgue, storage areas, old equipment, and the hospital's central mechanical systems. I'd been working nights for 7 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. Confused patients wandering the halls, homeless people trying to find warm places to sleep, even the occasional break-in attempt. But nothing, and I mean nothing, had prepared me for what I encountered on September 15th, 2023. It was a typical Thursday night. I'd done my usual rounds at midnight, 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. Everything was quiet. The hospital felt almost empty, with that peculiar stillness that settles over medical facilities in the early morning hours. You know the feeling when the building itself seems to be holding its breath. Around 2:30 a.m., I was in the security office reviewing camera feeds when something caught my attention on Monitor 7. Monitor 7 covered the basement elevator lobby, an area that should have been completely empty at that time of night. But there was movement. At first, I thought it might be maintenance staff. Sometimes the overnight crew would go down to check the boilers or replace filters in the HVAC system. But as I leaned closer to the screen, I realized this wasn't any maintenance worker I'd ever seen. A figure stood in front of the basement elevators, tall, thin, wearing what looked like a hospital gown that was too long. It dragged on the floor behind them like a wedding train. But here's what made my skin crawl. The person was completely motionless, not shifting weight, not looking around, not doing anything. Just standing there, facing the elevator doors. I watched for about 5 minutes, thinking maybe they were waiting for someone or confused about where they were. Patients sometimes got disoriented, especially at night. But this person never moved, not even to breathe that I could detect. I grabbed my radio and tried to contact the night supervisor, but all I got was static. The basement level has always had radio communication issues, something about the concrete and all the mechanical equipment interfering with signals. So I made a decision that I now regret every single night. I decided to go down there myself. The elevator ride to the basement level felt longer than usual. St. Catherine's is only 4 stories, but that night it felt like I was descending much deeper. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into the basement lobby and immediately felt that something was wrong. The temperature was at least 10 degrees colder than it should have been. I could see my breath, which had never happened before in all my years working there. The fluorescent lights were flickering in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic, and there was a smell in the air that I can only describe as medicinal, but not the normal hospital smell. This was stronger, older, like disinfectant that had been sitting in a sealed room for decades. The figure I'd seen on the monitor was gone. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, looking around the lobby. To my left was the morgue entrance. To my right, a hallway that led to storage areas and mechanical rooms. Straight ahead was another corridor that connected to the hospital's older wing, a section that had been built in the 1940s and was now mostly used for record storage. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway to my right. I called out, "Hello? This is hospital security. Can I help you?" The footsteps stopped immediately. I waited, listening. The silence was so complete that I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of the hospital's ventilation system. But no response to my call. I started walking toward the sound, pulling out my flashlight even though the hallway was lit. As I got closer to the storage area, I noticed that several of the overhead lights were out, creating pools of darkness between the working fixtures. "Hello?" I called again. "If you're lost, I can help you get back to your room." That's when I saw her. About 30 feet down the hallway, partially hidden in the shadows between two lights, stood a woman in a hospital gown. The same figure I'd seen on the monitor. But now I could see details that the security camera had missed. Her skin was pale, not just pale, but almost translucent. I could see dark veins beneath the surface, like a road map of her circulatory system. Her hair was long and dark, hanging down over her face, so I couldn't see her features clearly. And she was tall, much taller than she had appeared on the camera, maybe 6.5 feet, which made the hospital gown look like it belonged to a child. But the most disturbing thing was how still she was. Have you ever watched someone sleep and noticed how even unconscious people have tiny movements, micro adjustments, slight shifting, the rise and fall of breathing? This woman had none of that. She stood like a statue, like someone had frozen her mid-step. "Ma'am?" I said, taking a step closer. "Are you all right?" She turned her head toward me, and I saw her face. "I've worked security for 15 years in hospitals, office buildings, shopping centers. I've seen people in every state of distress, confusion, and medical emergency you can imagine, but I had never seen a face like hers. Her eyes were open, but they were completely white, not rolled back, not clouded by cataracts, just white, like someone had painted over them. Her mouth was slightly open, and I could see that her lips were blue. The kind of blue you see on someone who's been in cold water too long." She smiled at me. I don't think I've ever been more terrified in my entire life. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, and it didn't reach her eyes, which, given that her eyes were white, might have been impossible anyway. But there was something about that smile that made every instinct in my body scream at me to run. Instead, I took another step toward her. "Are you a patient here?" I asked, though my voice was shaking now. "Do you need help getting back to your room?" She didn't answer, but she started walking toward me. Not walking exactly, gliding. Her feet were moving, but she was covering ground too quickly, too smoothly, like she was on wheels or floating just slightly above the floor. I backed up, reaching for my radio again. Still nothing but static. "Ma'am, I need you to stop," I said, trying to use my authoritative security voice. "I need to call someone to help you." She kept coming. As she got closer, I could hear something that made my blood run cold. She was humming, a soft melodic tune that echoed off the concrete walls. It sounded familiar, like a lullaby or a hymn, but I couldn't place it. When she was about 10 feet away from me, she stopped. We stood there, looking at each other. Or rather, I was looking at her while she looked at me with those impossible white eyes. Up close, I could see that her skin wasn't just pale, it was almost see-through. I could make out the shape of bones in her face, the outline of her skull beneath the thin layer of flesh. "Who are you?" I whispered. She tilted her head to one side like a dog hearing a strange sound. Then she opened her mouth and spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming from far away, like an echo in a cave. "I'm waiting," she said. "Waiting for what?" "For them to bring me home." Before I could ask what she meant, the lights in the hallway went out. All of them simultaneously, leaving me in complete darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on, and sweeping the beam around the corridor. She was gone. I stood there in the dark for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes, listening for any sound, any indication of where she had gone. But there was nothing. The basement level was silent except for the mechanical hum of the hospital systems. I made my way back to the elevator as quickly as possible, constantly checking over my shoulder. When I reached the security office, I immediately pulled up the camera feeds for the basement level. Every monitor showed empty hallways, empty rooms, empty spaces. But then I noticed something on monitor 7, the one that covered the elevator lobby. In the timestamp from 2:45 a.m., exactly when I had been down there, the camera showed me standing alone in the lobby, looking around. There was no woman in a hospital gown, no one else in the frame at all. According to the security cameras, I had been talking to no one. I spent the rest of my shift reviewing footage from all the basement cameras, going back several hours. I never found any evidence of the woman I had encountered. No shots of her in the elevator, no footage of her in the hallways, nothing. It was as if she had never existed. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that when I left the hospital that morning, I looked back at the building and swore I could see a figure standing in one of the basement windows. Watching me go, I submitted my report to the hospital administration the next day, documenting everything that had happened. 3 days later, I was called into a meeting with the security supervisor and the hospital's risk management team. They told me that my report contained inconsistencies with available surveillance data and suggested that I might have been experiencing fatigue-related hallucinations due to working too many night shifts. They offered me a transfer to day shift security with a slight reduction in pay. When I declined and insisted that my experience had been real, they initiated a performance review process that resulted in my termination 2 weeks later. But before I left, I managed to copy some of the security footage from that night. Not the basement cameras. Those files had been mysteriously corrupted. But I got footage from the main floor elevators, and it shows something that the hospital's risk management team never saw. At 2:31 a.m., Elevator 3 shows someone getting on at the 4th floor and pressing the button for the basement level. But the camera angle only catches the person from behind, and the image quality is poor enough that you can't make out details. What you can see is someone tall, wearing what looks like a hospital gown, with long, dark hair. At 3:15 a.m., the same elevator shows someone getting on at the basement level and pressing the button for the 4th floor. Same person, same hospital gown, same dark hair. But in this shot, you can see something that makes my skin crawl every time I watch it. The timestamp shows the elevator doors closing at exactly 3:15:33 a.m. But for just a fraction of a second, before the doors are completely shut, the person in the hospital gown turns toward the camera. Her face is completely white. I've shared this footage with 3 different video analysis experts, and they all confirm that it hasn't been altered or manipulated. What they can't explain is how someone with no eyes, no visible pupils or irises, could have navigated through the hospital. used the elevators, and carried on a conversation with me. After I was fired from St. Catherine's, I did some research into the hospital's history. What I found made everything even more disturbing. St. Catherine's was built in 1962 on the site of an older medical facility called Mercy General Hospital. Mercy General had been constructed in 1943 and served the Portland area until 1961, when it was demolished to make way for the newer, larger St. Catherine's. But here's what the hospital's official history doesn't mention. Mercy General had been the site of a controversial medical research program in the 1950s. According to newspaper archives and medical records that I found at the Portland Historical Society, the hospital had participated in government-funded studies involving experimental treatments for catatonic patients. The program was shut down in 1959 after several patients died under suspicious circumstances. The official cause of death for all of them was listed as treatment-related complications. But the medical examiner's reports, which weren't made public until decades later, told a different story. All of the patients who died had similar symptoms in their final days: complete loss of pigmentation in their eyes, dramatically lowered body temperature, and a condition the doctors described as voluntary catatonia. They would stand motionless for hours at a time, completely unresponsive to external stimuli. The most disturbing part of the medical examiner's report was a note about the patient's final moments. According to witnesses, in the hours before they died, the patients would become animated and lucid. They would ask nurses and doctors when they would be going home and express confusion about where they were and why they were being held in the hospital. 7 patients died during the program. All of them were women. All of them were between the ages of 24 and 31, and all of them had been admitted to the hospital for treatment of what would now be diagnosed as severe depression or anxiety disorders. One of those patients was named Catherine Morrison. She was 29 years old when she died on September 15, 1959, exactly 64 years to the day before my encounter in the basement of St. Catherine's Hospital. I've never been back to St. Catherine's, but I keep in touch with a few people who still work there. According to my sources, there have been at least 6 other encounters with what staff members describe as the woman in the basement since my termination. The hospital administration has implemented a new policy requiring all basement-level work to be done in pairs, and security guards are no longer allowed to patrol the basement alone. They've also installed new security cameras throughout the basement level, high-definition night vision cameras that record everything 24 hours a day. But according to my contacts, the woman still appears on the monitors, and she's always standing in exactly the same spot at exactly the same time. 31 a.m. every night in front of the basement elevators, still waiting for someone to bring her home. Story 2, the Pediatric Ward Transferred Children's Memorial Hospital, Chicago, Illinois, October 2023. The second story comes from Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a pediatric resident who worked at Children's Memorial Hospital in Chicago. Dr. Martinez contacted me through an encrypted email service and provided documentation that she risked her career to obtain. She asked me not to use her real name, so I'm calling her Dr. Martinez. Here's her account. I need to start by saying that I love working with children. It's challenging, heartbreaking sometimes, but there's nothing more rewarding than helping a sick child get better. I've been in pediatric medicine for 8 years, and I thought I'd seen every possible situation that could arise in a children's hospital. I was wrong. Children's Memorial Hospital is a 200-bed facility that specializes in pediatric care. The building is relatively new, built in 1998, but it was constructed on the site of an older children's hospital that had served Chicago since the 1920s. When they built the new facility, they incorporated some of the basement infrastructure from the original building to save on construction costs. The basement level houses the hospital's central supply, mechanical systems, and what we call the transition room, a space used for transferring patients between different areas of the hospital when they need to be moved discreetly or when the main elevators are busy. On October 23, 2023, I was working the night shift in the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit. It had been a busy evening. We had several critical patients, including a 6-year-old boy named Tyler, who was recovering from emergency surgery. Tyler was stable, but required constant monitoring. So I was spending most of my time at his bedside, around 1:30 a.m. Tyler's mother, who had been sleeping in the chair next to his bed, woke up and asked if she could get some coffee from the vending machine down the hall. I told her that was fine, and she left the room. About 10 minutes later, I heard Tyler talking. This was unusual because he had been sedated and had barely been conscious since the surgery. I walked over to his bed to check on him. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" I asked. Tyler looked at me with those big, serious eyes that sick children sometimes get. "The girl," he said. "She wants to know if I want to come play with her." I looked around the room. Tyler's mother hadn't returned yet, and there were no other children in the PICU that night. "What girl, Tyler?" "The one in the white dress. She's right there." He pointed toward the corner of the room near the window. I followed his gaze, but I didn't see anyone. "Tyler, there's no one there. You might be having a dream from the medicine we gave you." "She's not a dream," Tyler said. "She told me her name is Emma. She said there are lots of kids downstairs who want to play, but they can't come up here because the grown-ups won't let them." A chill ran down my spine. In 8 years of pediatric medicine, I'd heard children talk about imaginary friends, hallucinations from medication, and confusion from being in an unfamiliar environment. But there was something about the way Tyler was talking, calm, matter-of-fact, like he was describing something perfectly normal, that made me uncomfortable. "What else did Emma tell you?" I asked. "She said the kids downstairs are lonely. They've been waiting for a long time for someone to come play with them. She asked if I wanted to come see their playroom." Before I could respond, Tyler's mother returned with her coffee. Tyler immediately stopped talking about Emma and seemed to fall back asleep within minutes. I decided not to mention the conversation to his mother. She had enough to worry about without me adding strange stories to her concerns. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Tyler had said. The reference to kids downstairs particularly bothered me. The basement level of Children's Memorial didn't have any patient rooms or play areas. It was purely utilitarian space. The next morning, I asked one of the senior nurses, Patricia, if she'd ever heard children talk about other kids in the basement. Patricia gave me a look that I couldn't quite read. "Why do you ask?" I told her about Tyler's conversation with Emma. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Dr. Martinez, how long have you been working nights here?" "About 6 months." "And this is the first time you've heard a child mention other kids downstairs?" "Yes, why? Is this common?" Patricia looked around to make sure no one else was listening. "Can you meet me for coffee after your shift? There are some things you should know about this place." That afternoon, Patricia and I met at a coffee shop several blocks from the hospital. What she told me changed my entire perspective on Children's Memorial. "The hospital has a problem," Patricia said. "It's been going on for years, but the administration doesn't acknowledge it officially. Children, especially the very sick ones, often report seeing other children in the hospital who aren't patients, hallucinations from medication. That's what everyone assumes, but there are patterns. The children always describe seeing other kids in old-fashioned clothing. They always mention a girl named Emma who wears a white dress, and they always say these children are somewhere downstairs where the grown-ups won't let them come up." Patricia had been working at Children's Memorial for 12 years. In that time, she estimated that at least 40 children had reported similar encounters. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Children in clothing from decades past, led by a girl named Emma, living in some kind of play area in the basement of the hospital. But here's what really disturbs me, Patricia continued. About 5 years ago, a maintenance worker found something in one of the old storage rooms in the basement. It was a room that had been sealed up during the construction of the new hospital, and they only opened it when they needed to run new electrical cables. What did they find? Children's belongings, toys, clothes, books, but not modern things. These were items from the 1950s and 60s, and there were medical records mixed in with the toys. Records for children who had been patients at the old hospital. Patricia told me that the maintenance worker had reported the discovery to hospital administration, but within a week the room had been cleaned out and sealed again. The worker was told that the items were historical artifacts that would be donated to a museum. But Patricia had checked with several local museums, and none of them had received any donations from Children's Memorial. I think they just threw everything away, she said. They didn't want anyone asking questions about why children's belongings were sealed up in the basement. After my conversation with Patricia, I couldn't stop thinking about the children's reports and the sealed room in the basement. I decided to do some research into the history of the original Children's Memorial Hospital. What I found was disturbing. The original hospital had operated from 1923 to 1997. During the 1950s and early 1960s, it had housed a special ward for children with long-term illnesses, conditions like tuberculosis, polio, and other diseases that required months or even years of treatment. Many of these children had been essentially abandoned by their families. In that era, having a child with a serious illness was considered shameful, and families often placed their children in the hospital and rarely visited. Some children spent their entire childhoods at the hospital with minimal contact with the outside world. According to the records I found, the long-term care ward was located in the basement level of the original hospital. It had been designed to keep the sickest children isolated from the rest of the patient population. But it had essentially become a place where families could abandon children they couldn't or wouldn't care for. The ward was closed in 1963 after a tuberculosis outbreak killed 11 children in a single month. The hospital administration cited inadequate ventilation and overcrowding as contributing factors to the outbreak. But what struck me most about the records was a note from one of the nurses who had worked in the long-term care ward. She had written, "The children have created their own community down here. They take care of each other in ways that we adults often fail to do. There's a little girl named Emma who seems to be their unofficial leader. She makes sure the younger ones aren't scared, organizes games and activities, and comforts the children who are homesick. She's only 8 years old, but she has the wisdom of someone much older." Emma had been a patient at the hospital for 3 years, from 1960 to 1963. She had been admitted for treatment of a rare bone disease that left her unable to walk without assistance. According to her medical records, she had been bright, cheerful, and incredibly nurturing toward the other children in the ward. Emma had died during the tuberculosis outbreak in March of 1963. She was 8 years old. Armed with this information, I decided to investigate the basement level of the current hospital myself. I knew it was risky. Hospital staff aren't supposed to wander around unescorted in non-patient areas, but I needed to understand what the children were seeing. 3 nights later, during a quiet period in my shift, I took the service elevator down to the basement level. I told myself I was just going to look around for a few minutes, see if there was anything that might explain the children's consistent reports. The basement level was dimly lit and much colder than the rest of the hospital. I could hear the hum of mechanical equipment and the occasional sound of pipes creaking in the walls. The hallways were longer than I had expected, with doors leading to storage rooms, mechanical spaces, and areas I couldn't identify. As I walked through the corridors, I tried to imagine what this space had looked like when it housed the long-term care ward. It was depressing to think of sick children spending their entire childhoods in these windowless, institutional hallways. That's when I heard it. Laughter, soft, distant laughter that sounded like children playing. I stopped walking and listened carefully, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the basement, past the areas I had already explored. I followed the sound down a corridor. That led to what appeared to be older parts of the basement, areas with different flooring and wall, construction that looked like they might have been part of the original hospital. The laughter got louder as I walked, and I began to hear other sounds too. Children's voices talking and giggling, the sound of games being played. It sounded exactly like what you might hear from a daycare center or school playground. At the end of the corridor, I found a door that was slightly ajar. The sounds were coming from the other side. I pushed the door open and looked inside. The room was empty, but it wasn't just empty. It was clearly a room that hadn't been used in decades. The walls were covered with peeling paint, the floor was dusty, and there were water stains on the ceiling. There was no electricity running to the room, and the only light came from my small flashlight. Yet I could still hear the children playing. The sounds were coming from all around me, as if the room were full of children, but I couldn't see anyone. I heard games of tag, jump rope rhymes, children counting for hide and seek, and underneath it all, a voice that sounded like a young girl giving gentle instructions and encouragement to the other children. "Emma?" I whispered. The sound stopped immediately. I stood there in the darkness, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, I heard a single voice, a little girl speaking so softly I could barely make out the words. "Are you here to play with us?" I looked around the empty room, trying to locate the source of the voice. "I'm a doctor," I said. "I work upstairs with sick children." "We know," the voice said. "We've been watching. You take good care of the children upstairs. But what about the children down here?" "What children down here?" "The children who never got to go home. The children who are still waiting for someone to remember them." I felt tears starting to form in my eyes. "Emma, is that you?" "I take care of the children here. I make sure they're not scared. But there are so many of them now, and they're lonely. They want to play with the children upstairs, but the grown-ups won't let them." "How many children are here, Emma?" "Lots. Children from the long time ago, and children from now. Children who got lost in the hospital and couldn't find their way home. Children who were too sick to get better, but too scared to leave." I thought about all the children who had died at Children's Memorial over the decades, all the families who had lost their children, all the young lives that had been cut short. "What can I do to help?" I asked. "Remember us?" Emma said. "Tell the grown-ups upstairs that we're here. Tell them we're not scary. We just want to play." Before I could respond, I heard footsteps in the corridor behind me. I turned around and saw a security guard walking toward the room with a flashlight. "Dr. Martinez? What are you doing down here?" I looked back into the room, but it was silent now. Whatever had been there was gone. "I thought I heard something," I said. "I was investigating." The security guard looked into the empty room, then back at me. "This area is off-limits to medical staff without maintenance escort. You need to return to your floor immediately." As we walked back toward the elevator, the security guard said, "This isn't the first time someone has reported hearing things in that room, but there's never anyone down here at night except maintenance staff." "What do you think it is?" The guard was quiet for a moment. "I've been working security here for 8 years. In that time, I've had to escort 12 different staff members out of the basement because they reported hearing children playing in empty rooms. The hospital's official position is that it's acoustic phenomena, sounds from upstairs carrying through the ventilation system. But you don't think that's what it is? I think this hospital was built on top of a lot of sadness. And sometimes sadness doesn't just go away because you build new walls over it. When I returned to the PICU, Tyler was awake. His mother was reading to him from a children's book. "Dr. Martinez," Tyler said when he saw me, "Emma came back while you were gone. She said to tell you thank you for visiting the playroom." Tyler's mother looked at me with concern. "He's been asking about Emma all evening. I told him there's no Emma in the hospital, but he insists she's real." I knelt down next to Tyler's bed. "What did Emma tell you?" "She said you came to see the other children downstairs. She said it made them very happy because most grown-ups don't believe they're there." Tyler's mother frowned. "Tyler, sweetheart, you know Emma is just in your imagination, right?" Tyler looked at his mother with that serious expression again. "Mommy, just because you can't see someone doesn't mean they're not real. Emma taught me that." Over the next several days, I continued to hear reports from other children in the hospital. A 10-year-old girl in the cardiac unit mentioned seeing children in old-fashioned clothes playing in the hallways at night. A 7-year-old boy in the cancer ward asked his parents why the other kids in the hospital weren't allowed to come to his room. All of the reports were consistent with what Tyler had described. Children in vintage clothing, led by a girl named Emma, who seemed to exist somewhere in the hospital but couldn't interact directly with the living patients. I started documenting these reports, creating a file of children's testimonies about their encounters with Emma and the other children. What I found was remarkable. Over the past 5 years, more than 60 children had reported similar experiences. But when I tried to share this information with the hospital administration, I was told that documenting patient hallucinations was outside the scope of my duties as a resident. I was advised to focus on medical treatment and to leave psychological phenomena to the appropriate specialists. 3 weeks after my encounter in the basement, I was called into a meeting with the chief of Pediatrics and the hospital's risk management team. They informed me that my unauthorized exploration of restricted areas had been recorded by security cameras and that my behavior was considered a violation of hospital policy. I was given a formal reprimand and told that any future infractions would result in termination from the residency program, but they couldn't stop me from continuing to listen to the children. Last month, a 5-year-old girl named Sarah was admitted to our ward for treatment of leukemia. On her 3rd night in the hospital, she told me that a girl named Emma had come to visit her. She said she knows what it's like to be sick for a long time, Sarah said. She said the children downstairs were sick too, but they're not hurt anymore. They just want to play and be happy. What did you tell Emma? I asked. I told her I wanted to play too, but I have to stay in bed because of my medicine. She said that's okay. She said she would wait for me to get better, and then maybe I could come visit the playroom. Sarah looked at me with those serious eyes that sick children sometimes get. "Dr. Martinez, do you think Emma is real?" I thought about the empty room in the basement, the sounds of children playing, the voice that had asked me to remember them. I said carefully, that there are lots of different ways to be real. And I think Emma is real in the way that matters most. Sarah smiled. That's what Emma said you would say. She said, "You're one of the good grown-ups who understands about children. I'm still working at Children's Memorial, but I've learned to be more careful about how I investigate the phenomena that the children report. I've also learned that Emma and the other children aren't something to be afraid of. They're something to be remembered." Every month, I leave small toys and books in the basement room where I first heard the children playing. When I return the next month, the items are always gone. I like to think that Emma and the other children are playing with them, somewhere in the spaces between what we can see and what we know to be true. The children upstairs still report seeing Emma and her friends, but now instead of dismissing these reports as hallucinations, I listen, I document what they tell me, and I make sure that Emma and all the children who never got to go home are remembered, because sometimes being remembered is the only way to find peace. Story 3, the surgical floor incident, Riverside Medical Center, Sacramento, California, November 2023. Our third story comes from David Kim, a surgical technician who worked at Riverside Medical Center in Sacramento for 6 years before the incident that ended his career there. David provided me with surgical logs, incident reports, and security footage that the hospital sealed under legal confidentiality agreements. Here's his account. I've been working in operating rooms for 12 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. Emergency surgeries, trauma cases, situations where we had to make life or death decisions in a matter of seconds. In the OR, you learn to stay calm under pressure, to focus on the task at hand, and to trust your training even when everything is going wrong. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened on November 8, 2023. Riverside Medical Center is a Level 1 trauma center, which means we handle the most serious emergency cases in the Sacramento area. The surgical floor is on the second level of the hospital, but the pre-op and recovery areas extend into the basement level to accommodate the high volume of surgeries we perform. The basement surgical prep area is where patients wait before surgery and where they're taken immediately after surgery, before being moved to recovery rooms upstairs. It's a busy area during the day, but at night it's usually quiet except for emergency cases. On November 8th, I was working the night shift as part of the emergency surgical team. We'd had a busy evening, 3 trauma cases from a multi-car accident on I-80, but by 2 a.m., things had finally quieted down. I was in the basement prep area, cleaning and sterilizing equipment for the next day's surgeries, when I heard a sound that made me look up from my work. It was the sound of a gurney being wheeled down the hallway. This wasn't unusual in itself. Sometimes patients are moved between areas during the night for various reasons, but what caught my attention was the time. It was 2:17 a.m., and according to the surgical schedule, there were no procedures planned until 6 a.m. I walked to the doorway of the prep room and looked down the hallway. About 50 feet away, I could see someone in surgical scrubs pushing a gurney toward the old elevator that connected the basement level to the main surgical floor. The person was moving slowly, deliberately, and there was something about their posture that seemed off. They were hunched over slightly, as if they were very tired or carrying a heavy burden. I called out, "Hey, do you need any help with that?" The person stopped pushing the gurney, but didn't turn around. I walked closer, thinking that maybe they hadn't heard me clearly. As I got nearer, I could see that the gurney had a patient on it, someone covered with a white sheet lying very still. "Excuse me," I said, louder this time. "Is everything okay?" The person in scrubs finally turned around, and I saw their face. It was Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a surgeon who had worked at Riverside for 15 years. Dr. Chen was well respected, experienced, and known for her professionalism and skill. But as she looked at me, I could see that something was wrong. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were unfocused, like she was sleepwalking. She was wearing full surgical attire, scrubs, cap, mask, but her movements seemed mechanical, automatic. "Dr. Chen," I said, "are you all right?" She stared at me for a long moment, as if she was trying to remember who I was. Then she spoke in a voice that sounded strange, hollow. "I have to take him to surgery," she said. I looked at the gurney. The patient was completely covered by the sheet, and I couldn't see any movement that would indicate breathing. "Dr. Chen, what surgery?" There is nothing scheduled until morning. He's been waiting, she said. He's been waiting for a long time. I have to fix him. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. Dr. Chen's behavior, the unscheduled patient transport, the late hour, none of it made sense. Let me check the surgical schedule, I said, pulling out my phone to access the hospital's scheduling system. Dr. Chen shook her head. It's not on the schedule. This is different. This is from before. Before what? Before we knew how to save them. I was starting to get seriously concerned about Dr. Chen's mental state. She was talking like she was confused about time and place, which could indicate a medical emergency like a stroke or severe exhaustion. Dr. Chen, I think you should sit down. Let me call someone to help you. But she had already started pushing the gurney again, heading toward the old elevator. I followed her, trying to figure out what to do. Should I physically stop her? Call security? Try to contact another doctor? The elevator she was heading toward was one that I rarely saw used. It was an older freight elevator that connected the basement level to the upper floors, but it was mainly used for transporting large equipment or supplies. I didn't even know if it was rated for patient transport. Dr. Chen reached the elevator and pressed the call button. While we waited for it to arrive, I tried to get a better look at the patient on the gurney. The sheet was covering the entire body, including the face, which struck me as odd. Patients being transported for surgery aren't usually covered completely. You need to be able to monitor their breathing and vital signs. Dr. Chen, can I check on the patient's condition? I asked. He doesn't need monitoring, she said. He's been stable for a long time. The elevator arrived with a mechanical grinding sound that echoed through the hallway. Dr. Chen pushed the gurney inside, and I followed, still trying to understand what was happening. Which floor are we going to? I asked. Sub-basement, Dr. Chen said, pressing a button I didn't even know existed. I looked at the elevator control panel. There were buttons for floors 1 through 6 and basement level, but there was also a button marked SB that I had never noticed before. Dr. Chen, there are no operating rooms in the sub-basement. That's just storage and mechanical equipment. She looked at me with those unfocused eyes. There used to be an operating room down there. That's where we did the surgeries that no one was supposed to know about. The elevator began to descend, but it felt like we were going down much farther than one floor. The ride seemed to take several minutes, and I could hear the mechanical systems groaning and creaking around us. When the elevator finally stopped and the doors opened, I found myself looking at a hallway that I had never seen before. The walls were older, with different paint and construction than the rest of the hospital. The lighting was dimmer, and there was a smell in the air that reminded me of old medical facilities, a mixture of disinfectant, and something else that I couldn't identify. Dr. Chen pushed the gurney out of the elevator and started down the hallway. I hesitated for a moment, then followed her. I was completely lost at this point, but I felt like I couldn't leave her alone in her apparent state of confusion. The hallway led to a series of rooms with glass windows, like observation areas. As we passed each room, I could see that they contained old medical equipment, surgical tables, anesthesia machines, monitors that looked like they were from decades ago. Dr. Chen, what is this place? This is where they brought the patients they couldn't save upstairs, she said. The experimental cases, the ones where they tried new procedures that weren't approved yet. We reached the end of the hallway, where there was a set of double doors marked OR7. Dr. Chen pushed the gurney through the doors, and I followed her into what was clearly an old operating room. The room was much smaller than the modern ORs upstairs, and all of the equipment was outdated. But everything was clean and appeared to be in working order, as if someone had been maintaining it regularly. Dr. Chen positioned the gurney in the center of the room and began preparing for what appeared to be surgery. She turned on monitors, adjusted lights, and arranged surgical instruments with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times. Dr. Chen, you can't perform surgery down here. This equipment hasn't been certified and we don't have anesthesia or support staff. We don't need anesthesia, she said. He can't feel anything anymore. That's when I realized what she meant, and I felt my blood run cold. I walked over to the gurney and carefully lifted the edge of the sheet covering the patient's face. The person on the gurney was dead. Not recently dead. They had the pale gray appearance of someone who had been deceased for hours, possibly days. Dr. Chen, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, this patient is dead. We need to call the coroner and... He's not dead, she interrupted. He's waiting. They're all waiting. They've been waiting for someone to finish the surgery. She picked up a scalpel and moved toward the gurney. I grabbed her wrist, stopping her from making an incision. Dr. Chen, you need to stop. This isn't real. This patient is dead, and you're not thinking clearly. She looked at me with those unfocused eyes, and for a moment I thought I saw recognition there, like she was starting to wake up from whatever trance she had been in. But then she looked around the operating room, and her expression changed to one of confusion and fear. Where am I? She whispered. How did I get here? You're in the sub-basement of the hospital. You brought a deceased patient down here, and we're trying to perform surgery. I think you might be having some kind of medical episode. Dr. Chen looked at the dead patient on the gurney, then at the surgical instruments in her hands. She dropped the scalpel and stepped back, her face filled with horror. I don't remember coming down here, she said. I don't remember any of this. What's the last thing you remember? I was in the locker room, changing out of my scrubs after the trauma surgeries. I was exhausted. I remember thinking that I just wanted to go home and sleep. Dr. Chen looked around the operating room again. David, what is this place? I've worked here for 15 years and I've never seen this room. I don't know, I said honestly. But we need to get you upstairs and have someone examine you, and we need to report this patient to the appropriate authorities. As we prepared to leave the operating room, Dr. Chen noticed something that made her stop. On a table near the wall was a surgical logbook, the kind that ORs use to record procedures. She walked over and opened it. David, look at this. The logbook contained entries dating back to the 1980s, page after page of surgical procedures performed in the same operating room by doctors whose names I didn't recognize. But what made my skin crawl was the pattern of the entries. According to the log, surgeries were performed in this room almost every night for decades, and many of the patient names appeared multiple times, as if the same patients were undergoing the same procedures over and over again. Dr. Chen flipped to the most recent entries. The last page contained entries from the past month, written in handwriting that looked exactly like Dr. Chen's. The entries documented surgeries performed on patients who, according to their descriptions, had been dead for varying lengths of time. I didn't write these, Dr. Chen said, her voice shaking. I've never seen this logbook before in my life, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers, and the signatures matched the signature on her medical license perfectly. We left the operating room immediately, taking the logbook with us. The elevator ride back to the basement level felt even longer than the trip down, and when the doors opened, I was relieved to see the familiar hallways of the modern hospital. I escorted Dr. Chen to the employee health clinic and stayed with her until one of the attending physicians could examine her. While we waited, she kept asking me questions about what had happened, trying to piece together the missing time. David, did I really try to operate on a dead patient? Dr. Chen, I think you were sleepwalking, or maybe you had some kind of medical episode that affected your memory. But yes, you brought a deceased patient to an operating room in the sub-basement and prepared to perform surgery. But I don't understand where the patient came from. Are you sure they were dead? I had been wondering about that myself. I'm not sure where the patient came from, but they were definitely deceased. We need to report this to security so they can investigate. Dr. Chen was examined by Dr. Patterson, one of the emergency department physicians. All of her vital signs were normal, and she showed no signs of stroke, drug intoxication, or other medical conditions that might explain her behavior. But Dr. Patterson was concerned about the memory loss and recommended that Dr. Chen take medical leave until she could undergo a full neurological evaluation. After Dr. Chen left with Dr. Patterson, I went to find hospital security to report the incident. I told them about the deceased patient in the sub-basement operating room and provided them with the surgical logbook we had found. 2 security guards accompanied me back to the old elevator to investigate. But when we pressed the button marked SB, nothing happened. The button didn't light up, and the elevator didn't move. That button hasn't worked in years, one of the guards told me. The sub-basement level was sealed off in the 1990s due to structural issues. There's no way to access it from this elevator, but I was just down there an hour ago, I insisted. The guards looked at each other with the kind of expression that suggested they thought I was having my own medical episode. We took the regular elevator to the basement level and searched every room, looking for the deceased patient that Dr. Chen had been transporting. We found nothing. No gurney, no patient. No evidence that anyone had been in the basement surgical prep area except me. The guards asked me to write a detailed report of the incident, which I did. But I could tell from their questions that they thought I had imagined the whole thing. The next day, I was called into a meeting with the hospital administration, including the chief of surgery, the director of nursing, and the risk management team. They informed me that Dr. Chen had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation of the incident. They also told me that my report contained inconsistencies with physical evidence and facility layout, and suggested that I might have been experiencing work-related stress hallucinations. I asked about the surgical logbook that we had found in the sub-basement operating room, Mr. Kim. The risk management director said, "There is no sub-basement operating room. The sub-basement level of this hospital has been sealed and inaccessible for over 20 years. Whatever you think you saw down there was not real, but the logbook, there was no logbook. Security found no evidence of any logbook in your possession or anywhere in the hospital." I stared at them. "I handed the logbook directly to security last night. I have witnesses." The security guards who accompanied you on your search reported that you were carrying no items and that you appeared to be disoriented and confused. I realized that I was in serious trouble. Either I was having some kind of mental breakdown, or the hospital administration was covering up something that they didn't want to acknowledge. What happened to Dr. Chen? I asked. Dr. Chen reported that she experienced a brief episode of disorientation, but has no memory of any of the events you described. Her medical evaluation found no evidence of any condition that would impair her judgment or memory. I was given a choice: accept a transfer to the day shift with a notation in my personnel file regarding stress-related performance issues, or face termination for filing false incident reports. I chose the transfer, but I continued to investigate what had happened that night. Over the next several weeks, I talked to other employees who had worked at Riverside for many years. What I learned was disturbing. According to several longtime employees, there had been a sub-basement level at the original hospital, which had been built in the 1960s. The sub-basement had housed experimental surgical suites that were used for procedures that weren't approved by the medical board. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Riverside had participated in several controversial medical research programs including experimental surgeries on terminally ill patients who had consented to be test subjects for unproven procedures. Many of these experimental surgeries had taken place in the sub-basement operating rooms, away from the scrutiny of medical oversight committees and families who might object to the use of their loved ones as test subjects. Programs had been shut down in 1993 after several patients died during experimental procedures, and the sub-basement level had been sealed to prevent further access. But according to the employees I spoke with, there had been persistent reports over the years of staff members experiencing episodes where they would attempt to access the sealed sub-basement level or perform unauthorized procedures on deceased patients. Most of these incidents had been attributed to work-related stress, exhaustion, or medical conditions affecting the staff members involved. But the pattern was consistent. Experienced medical professionals would inexplicably attempt to continue surgeries or treatments on patients who were already deceased. I also learned that Dr. Chen was not the first surgeon to experience this type of episode. Over the past 15 years, at least 6 other doctors and nurses had been placed on administrative leave after similar incidents. All of them had reported memory loss surrounding the episodes. All of them had been found attempting to perform medical procedures in areas of the hospital that were either restricted or, according to hospital administration, non-existent, and all of them had eventually left Riverside Medical Center, either through resignation or termination. I decided to do more research into the hospital's history and the experimental surgery programs. What I found was a trail of medical records, research documents, and legal settlements that painted a picture of systematic abuse of terminally ill patients. Between 1982 and 1993, Riverside Medical Center had performed more than 300 experimental surgeries on patients who had little or no chance of survival. Many of these patients had been elderly, homeless, or otherwise vulnerable individuals who had limited family support or advocacy. The consent forms for these procedures had been deliberately vague, and many patients had not fully understood that they were participating in experimental research rather than receiving standard medical treatment. The experimental surgery program had been shut down after a whistleblower nurse provided evidence to state medical authorities that patients were being used as test subjects without proper informed consent. But the most disturbing part of the records I found was a note from one of the program's directors, written shortly before the shutdown. The experimental subjects have shown remarkable resilience and adaptation to the procedures. Even in cases where clinical death has occurred, subjects continue to exhibit responsiveness to surgical intervention. We believe this may be due to psychological rather than physiological factors. The subject's expectation that medical treatment will continue may be creating a form of post-mortem awareness that allows for continued interaction with medical staff. I think about that note every time I remember my encounter with Dr. Chen in the sub-basement operating a room. I think about the surgical logbook, with its entries documenting procedures on deceased patients, and I think about the possibility that somewhere beneath Riverside Medical Center, in sealed operating rooms that officially don't exist, patients who died during experimental surgeries are still waiting for someone to finish the procedures that were started but never completed. Dr. Chen returned to work after a month of medical leave, but she requested a transfer to the day shift and refused to work in the basement levels of the hospital. She never spoke to me about what had happened that night, but I could see in her eyes that she remembered more than she had told the hospital administration. I continued working at Riverside for 6 more months, but I could never shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the place. Every time I worked the night shift, every time I was alone in the basement levels, I found myself listening for the sound of gurneys being wheeled down empty hallways. I finally resigned and took a position at a different hospital. But before I left, I made sure to document everything I had experienced and learned about Riverside's history, because I believe that somewhere in the sealed sub-basement levels of that hospital, patients are still waiting for someone to help them. And sometimes, late at night, the doctors and nurses who once tried to save them are still answering that call. Story 4. The Morgue Attendant Valley General Hospital, Phoenix, Arizona, December 2023. Our fourth story comes from Lisa Thompson, a morgue attendant who worked at Valley General Hospital in Phoenix for 9 years. Lisa contacted me after seeing news coverage of other hospital encounters, and she provided me with security footage and documentation that she obtained before leaving her position. She asked me to use her real name because, as she put it, people need to know the truth about what happens in that place. Here's her account. Working in a hospital morgue isn't for everyone, but I found it peaceful. There's a quiet dignity to caring for people in their final moments with us, and I took pride in making sure that families could say goodbye to their loved ones with respect and closure. Valley General Hospital is a 350-bed facility that serves the Phoenix metropolitan area. The morgue is located in the basement level, which also houses the hospital's pathology lab, storage areas, and some administrative offices. It's a busy facility. We handle about 400 cases per year, including natural deaths, accident victims, and cases that require autopsy. I started working at Valley General in 2014, and for the first 8 years, everything was normal. I worked day shifts mostly, preparing bodies for family viewing, assisting with autopsies, and maintaining the facility. It was challenging work, but rewarding in its own way. In 2022, I was promoted to senior morgue attendant, which meant I occasionally had to work night shifts and weekends when the regular day staff wasn't available. That's when I started noticing things that I couldn't explain. The first incident occurred on December 3, 2022. I was working a Saturday night shift, catching up on paperwork and preparing bodies for Monday morning autopsies. The morgue was quiet. We had 6 bodies in cold storage, and I was alone in the facility, except for security guards who occasionally patrolled the basement level. Around 11 p.m., I heard a sound that made me look up from my desk. It was the sound of one of the cold storage units opening. Cold storage units don't open by themselves. They have magnetic locks that require a key card to access, and they're designed to stay sealed unless someone deliberately opens them. I walked over to the storage area and found that Unit 7 was standing open. According to my records, Unit 7 contained the body of an elderly man named Robert Martinez, who had died of heart failure 2 days earlier. He was scheduled for autopsy on Monday morning. I looked inside the unit, and Mr. Martinez's body was exactly where it should be, properly positioned and covered. Nothing appeared to be disturbed. I closed the unit and checked the electronic lock system. According to the digital log, the unit had been accessed at 11:03 p.m. using my key card. But I had been sitting at my desk across the room at 11:03 p.m., and my key card had been in my pocket the entire time. I assumed it was a malfunction in the electronic system and made a note to have maintenance check the locks in the morning. But then it happened again. 3 nights later, during another weekend shift, I heard the same sound, a cold storage unit opening. This time, it was Unit 12, which contained the body of a middle-aged woman who had died in a car accident. Again, according to the electronic log, the unit had been accessed using my key card at a time when I was nowhere near the storage area. Over the next month, this happened 7 more times. All was during night shifts when I was alone in the morgue. Always units containing bodies that had died within the past few days, and always with the electronic system recording that I had accessed the units. Even though I hadn't, I reported the issue to hospital maintenance, and they replaced all of the electronic locks on the cold storage units. But the problem continued. On January 15th, 2023, something happened that made me realize this wasn't a technical malfunction. I was working a Sunday night shift, and I had just finished preparing a body for a Monday morning funeral. It was about 10:30 p.m., and I was cleaning up my work area when I heard the familiar sound of a cold storage unit opening. But this time, instead of just walking over to close the unit, I decided to watch from across the room to see if I could figure out what was causing the problem. Unit 9 was standing open. According to my records, it contained the body of a young man named David Chen, who had died in a motorcycle accident the previous Friday. As I watched, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A hand emerged from inside the unit, not the hand of someone reaching in from outside. This was a hand coming from inside the unit, grasping the edge of the opening as if someone was trying to pull themselves out. I stood frozen, watching as the hand was followed by an arm, then a shoulder, and finally the upper body of David Chen. But David Chen was dead. I had prepared his body myself. I had seen the accident reports, the medical examiner's findings, the death certificate. There was no question that he was deceased. Yet, there he was, sitting up in the cold storage unit, looking around the morgue with an expression of confusion and concern. He saw me watching from across the room and made eye contact. His lips moved as if he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. I don't know how long we stared at each other. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few seconds. Then David Chen lay back down in the unit, and the door slowly closed by itself. I stood there shaking for several minutes, trying to process what I had just witnessed. Then I walked over to Unit 9 and opened it using my key card. David Chen's body was exactly as I had left it, properly positioned, covered, showing all the signs of death that I had documented when he was brought in. But when I looked at his face, I could swear that his expression had changed slightly, as if he had been trying to communicate something important. I called hospital security and asked them to come down to the morgue. When the guard arrived, I told him what I had seen. "Lisa, you've been working too many night shifts," he said. "Dead bodies don't sit up and look around. Maybe you should take a break." But I knew what I had seen. And over the next several months, it happened again and again. Bodies in cold storage would access their own units somehow, causing the doors to open. When I investigated, I would sometimes catch glimpses of the deceased individuals moving around inside the units, sitting up, looking around, apparently trying to communicate. But whenever I opened the units to investigate, the bodies would be motionless and positioned exactly as they should be. I started documenting these incidents, taking photographs of the electronic access logs and making detailed notes about each occurrence. What I discovered was disturbing. The incidents were not random. They followed a pattern. Bodies that had died suddenly or traumatically were more likely to trigger the storage unit openings. Car accident victims, heart attack patients, people who had died unexpectedly without time to prepare for death. Bodies that had died after long illnesses or natural causes rarely caused problems with the storage units, and the incidents always occurred within the first 72 hours after death. After 3 days, the electronic malfunctions stopped. I began to suspect that what I was witnessing wasn't mechanical failure or hallucinations. I thought that maybe some people who died suddenly were having difficulty accepting their death and were somehow able to interact with the physical world for a brief period after their bodies had stopped functioning. To test this theory, I started talking to the bodies when the storage units opened unexpectedly. On March 8, 2023, Unit 14 opened during my night shift. It contained the body of a woman named Sarah Williams, who had died of a sudden heart attack while grocery shopping. She was only 35 years old, with 2 young children. When I heard the unit open, I walked over and found Sarah sitting up inside, looking around the morgue with a confused expression. "Sarah?" I said softly. "Can you hear me?" She turned toward the sound of my voice and nodded slightly. "Sarah, you're in the hospital morgue. You died of a heart attack on Tuesday. Do you remember what happened?" Sarah's mouth moved, but no sound came out. She looked distressed, as if she was trying to speak, but couldn't. "Are you worried about your children?" I asked. Sarah nodded vigorously and pointed toward the ceiling, as if indicating something upstairs. "Your children are okay," I told her. "They're with your sister. She's taking good care of them." Sarah's expression changed to one of relief. She smiled slightly and lay back down in the unit. The door closed gently. When I checked on Sarah's body the next morning, she appeared peaceful in a way that she hadn't before. And for the remaining time that her body was in our care, Unit 14 never opened unexpectedly again. I started applying this approach to all of the unexpected storage unit openings. When I encountered deceased individuals who seemed to be confused or distressed, I would talk to them, provide information about their loved ones, and try to help them understand what had happened to them. In most cases, this seemed to help. After our conversations, the electronic malfunctions would stop, and the bodies would remain peaceful until they were released to funeral homes or families. But there was one case that was different from all the others. On November 15th, 2023, we received the body of a man named Thomas Anderson, who had died in his apartment. He was 45 years old, lived alone, and had apparently died of natural causes. Though the exact cause was unclear pending autopsy results, Thomas had been dead for several days before his body was discovered, which was unusual for the cases that typically caused storage unit malfunctions. But on his first night in the morgue, Unit 3 opened unexpectedly. When I went to investigate, I found Thomas sitting up in the unit, but his appearance was different from the other deceased individuals I had encountered. Thomas looked angry. His face was contorted in an expression of rage and frustration, and when he saw me, he pointed at me with an accusatory gesture. "Thomas?" I said. "What's wrong? What are you trying to tell me?" Thomas's mouth moved, and this time I could hear a faint whisper. "Murder," he said. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Thomas, what do you mean? Who was murdered?" "Me," he whispered. "They killed me." Thomas lay back down, and the unit closed. But unlike the other cases, Unit 3 continued to open unexpectedly for the next several nights. Each time, Thomas would sit up and repeat the same word, "Murder?" I didn't know what to do with this information. Thomas's death had been classified as natural causes, and there was no evidence of foul play. But his insistence that he had been murdered was disturbing. I decided to do some research into Thomas's background and the circumstances of his death. What I found was troubling. Thomas Anderson had been a forensic accountant who specialized in investigating financial fraud. At the time of his death, he had been working on a case involving embezzlement at a large corporation in Phoenix. According to news reports, Thomas had recently discovered evidence of a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme and had been preparing to present his findings to federal investigators. He died 3 days before his scheduled meeting with the FBI. The police investigation into Thomas's death had been brief and superficial. The responding officers had found no signs of forced entry or struggle in his apartment. Thomas had a history of heart problems, so a heart attack seemed like a reasonable explanation for his death. But Thomas's insistence that he had been murdered made me wonder if the investigation had been thorough enough. Decided to share Thomas's claims with the appropriate authorities, but I knew I needed evidence beyond my conversations with a dead man. On November 20th, When Unit 3 opened again and Thomas sat up, I was ready with a digital recorder. "Thomas, can you tell me what happened to you? How were you murdered?" Thomas's whispered response was barely audible, but the recorder picked it up. "Poison in the coffee. Who poisoned you, Thomas?" "Man in suit knew about. The money." "What money, Thomas?" "Stolen. Millions. They knew. I found it." Thomas lay back down and didn't communicate again that night. But the next morning, I took the recording to the Phoenix Police Department and requested that they reopen the investigation into Thomas's death. The detective I spoke with was skeptical about my claims, but he agreed to review the case files. More importantly, he agreed to request that the medical examiner test Thomas's body for poisons that might not have been detected in the initial examination. The toxicology results came back. 2 weeks later, Thomas Anderson had died of poisoning from a rare plant toxin that mimics the symptoms of heart failure. The poison had been administered in a liquid form, most likely in a beverage. The police investigation was reopened, and within a month, they had arrested a man named Michael Harrison, who worked for the corporation that Thomas had been investigating. Harrison had met with Thomas the day before his death, ostensibly to discuss the fraud case. Harrison eventually confessed to poisoning Thomas's coffee during their meeting. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But here's the part that still gives me chills. The night after Harrison was arrested, Unit 3 opened one final time. Thomas sat up in the cold storage unit and looked directly at me. This time his expression wasn't angry or frustrated. He looked peaceful, grateful. He mouthed the words, "Thank you," and then lay back down. Unit 3 never opened unexpectedly again. I continued working at Valley General for several more months, but my experiences in the morgue had changed my perspective on death and what might happen to consciousness after the body stops functioning. I began to believe that some people who die suddenly or traumatically may retain some form of awareness for a brief period after death, especially if they have unfinished business or unresolved concerns. In Thomas's case, his concern about justice for his murder had somehow enabled him to communicate with the living world long enough to ensure that his killer was caught, but the hospital administration didn't appreciate my theories about post-mortem consciousness. In February 2024, I was called into a meeting with the chief of pathology and the hospital's risk management team. They had reviewed the incident reports I had filed about the storage unit malfunctions and my conversations with deceased patients. I was told that my reports contained non-scientific claims and unprofessional speculation about the nature of death and consciousness. They suggested that I might be experiencing occupational stress from working with deceased individuals for extended periods. I was given the option to transfer to a different department or face termination for failure to maintain professional standards. I chose to resign rather than transfer. But before I left, I made sure to document everything I had experienced and learned during my time in the morgue. I'm sharing my story because I believe that death is not always as final as we assume. Some people who die suddenly or with unfinished business may retain the ability to communicate with the living world, at least temporarily, and sometimes they have important things to tell us. If you work in a hospital, especially in areas where deceased patients are cared for, I encourage you to listen. Pay attention to unusual equipment malfunctions, unexpected sounds, and other phenomena that might be dismissed as mechanical problems. You might be receiving a message from someone who desperately needs to be heard, because sometimes the dead have the most important stories to tell. Story 5, the psychiatric ward evacuation, Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital, Denver, Colorado, January 2024. Our final story comes from Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a psychiatrist who worked at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital in Denver for 12 years before the facility was permanently closed in February 2024. Dr. Rodriguez provided me with patient records, security footage, and internal documents that were sealed as part of legal proceedings surrounding the hospital's closure. She insisted that I use her real name because, as she said, the patients deserve to have someone tell their story. Here's her account. Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital was a 150-bed facility that specialized in treating patients with severe mental illness, particularly those who required long-term inpatient care. The hospital had operated since 1967, and by the time I started working there in 2012, it was showing its age. The building was a maze of corridors, treatment rooms, and patient wards spread across 4 floors. The basement level housed the hospital's medical records, storage areas, and what we called the historical wing, a section of the original hospital. That was no longer used for patient care, but contained archives and old equipment. I specialized in treating patients with treatment-resistant depression, schizophrenia, and other severe psychiatric conditions. Many of our patients had been hospitalized for months or even years, and some had lived at Millbrook for most of their adult lives. It was challenging work, but I found it meaningful. These were patients who had been failed by other parts of the mental health system, and at Millbrook, we were often their last hope for stability and recovery. But in January 2024, something happened that changed everything about how I understood mental illness, institutional care, and the nature of reality itself. It started with the patient's reports about voices. Now, hearing voices is not uncommon among psychiatric patients, particularly those with schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders. But in mid-January, we began to notice that many of our patients were reporting voices that were different from their usual auditory hallucinations. These voices were clearer, more coherent, and they were saying things that didn't fit the typical patterns of psychiatric symptoms. The first patient to report these new voices was Margaret Patterson, a 54-year-old woman who had been hospitalized at Millbrook for 3 years with treatment-resistant schizophrenia. Margaret's usual auditory hallucinations were fragmented, threatening, and clearly connected to her mental illness. But on January 16th, Margaret approached me during morning rounds with a very different kind of report. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said, "there are new people talking to me. They're not the usual voices. These are different." "How are they different, Margaret?" "They're clearer. And they're not saying mean things. They're asking for help." I sat down with Margaret to discuss these new auditory experiences. What she told me was unlike anything I had heard from a psychiatric patient in 12 years of practice. "They say they're patients who used to live here, but they can't leave. They're stuck in the basement and they want someone to help them get home." "How many voices are you hearing?" "Lots, maybe 10 or 15 different people. They take turns talking to me. They say they've been trying to talk to people for a long time, but most people can't hear them." "What else do they tell you?" Margaret looked thoughtful. "They tell me their names, and they tell me about when they lived here, before the hospital got renovated. They say there used to be patient rooms in the basement, and that's where they lived." I made notes about Margaret's report, planning to adjust her medication if these new voices became problematic. But over the next few days, I began hearing similar reports from other patients. James Wright, a 38-year-old man with bipolar disorder, told me that he was hearing voices of former patients who were trapped in the old part of the hospital. Susan Miller, a 45-year-old woman with severe depression, reported that voices were asking her to tell the doctors about the people downstairs who need help. Within a week, 8 different patients were reporting virtually identical auditory experiences, voices of former patients who claimed to be stuck in the basement level of the hospital and were asking for help. This was highly unusual. Psychiatric patients don't typically experience shared hallucinations with consistent themes and details. Usually, auditory hallucinations are unique to each individual and reflect their personal psychological struggles, but these reports were remarkably similar across different patients with different diagnoses and different treatment histories. On January 23rd, I decided to investigate these claims by researching the history of Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. What I found was disturbing. The original Millbrook facility, built in 1967, had included patient housing in the basement level. These basement rooms had been used for patients who were considered difficult to manage, individuals with severe behavioral problems who were isolated from the general patient population. According to historical records, the basement patient areas had been closed in 1985 following a state investigation into patient care practices. The investigation had found evidence of inadequate supervision, substandard living conditions, and possible patient abuse in the basement housing areas. But the most troubling part of the historical records was a list of patients who had died while housed in the EM basement areas between 1967 and 1985. 18 patients had died during that period, most from what were listed as medical complications or accidents, but several of the death reports contained notes suggesting that patients had died under suspicious circumstances or had been found dead under unexplained conditions. Most significantly, none of the patients who died in the basement areas had any family members who claimed their bodies. All 18 had been buried in unmarked graves in the hospital's cemetery plot. I compared the names from the historical death records with the names that our current patients were reporting. From their auditory experiences, there were 7 matches. Our patients were reporting voices from individuals who had actually died in the basement levels of Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital decades ago. This could have been a coincidence. Perhaps our patients had somehow learned about the hospital's history and were incorporating that information into their hallucinations. But I couldn't find any way that they could have accessed historical records that were stored in sealed archives. On January 25th, I decided to visit the basement levels of the hospital to see if there was anything that might explain the patient's consistent reports. The basement level was divided into 2 sections: the modern area that housed medical records and storage, and the historical wing that contained the original basement patient areas from the 1960s and 70s. I had been in the modern basement area many times, but I had never explored the historical wing. It had been sealed off for decades and was supposedly used only for long-term storage of old equipment and records. I obtained permission from hospital administration to access the historical wing for what I described as research into the facility's treatment history. The historical wing was accessed through a heavy metal door that had been painted over multiple times and was clearly not opened regularly. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I immediately noticed that the temperature was much cooler than the rest of the basement, and there was a musty smell that suggested the area had been closed off for a very long time. The hallway led to a series of rooms that had clearly once been used for patient housing. The rooms were small, with barred windows and heavy doors that could be locked from the outside. Some still contained old furniture, metal bed frames, wooden chairs, and small tables. But what struck me most about the rooms was how institutional and isolating they felt. These weren't treatment rooms designed for healing. They were essentially prison cells designed to contain people who were considered problematic. As I walked through the historical wing, I began to understand why patients had been isolated down here. The basement rooms were far from the main hospital areas, with poor ventilation and minimal natural light. Patients housed here would have been effectively cut off from the rest of the hospital community. and from any oversight by family members or outside advocates. In one of the rooms, I found something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the paint on one of the walls were dozens of names, dates, and messages. They appeared to have been carved with fingernails or small objects over many years. Mary Johnson, 1972. Please help me go home. Robert Davis, 1974. I want to see my sister. Helen Thompson, 1979. They won't let me leave. Thomas Anderson, 1981. I'm not crazy. I don't belong here. Many of the names matched the historical death records I had found. These were messages from patients who had lived in the basement isolation rooms and had apparently died there without ever being able to leave. But as disturbing as the carved messages were, what I found next was even worse. In the last room at the end of the hallway, I discovered what appeared to be a makeshift shrine. Someone had arranged dozens of personal items, jewelry, photographs, letters, small mementos, on a table in the center of the room. These were clearly belongings that had belonged to patients who had lived in the basement areas, items that should have been returned to families or disposed of when the patients died, but had instead been collected and preserved in this hidden room. Among the items, I found identification cards, medical bracelets, and personal letters that confirmed these belongings had belonged to the patients whose names our current patients were reporting in their auditory experiences. As I examined the shrine, I heard something that made me freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway behind me. I turned around and saw a figure standing in the doorway of the room. It was a woman, probably in her 40s, wearing a hospital gown that looked like it was from decades ago. Her hair was gray and unkempt, and her face had the hollow, institutional look of someone who had spent years in psychiatric care. But what struck me most about her appearance was that she looked translucent, as if I was seeing her through a layer of fog or frosted glass. "Are you Dr. Rodriguez?" she asked in a voice that sounded distant and hollow. I couldn't speak. I just nodded. "I'm Mary Johnson. I've been trying to talk to the doctors upstairs for a long time. The patients can hear us, but the doctors usually can't." I found my voice. "Mary, you died in 1972. You can't be here." Mary smiled sadly. "I know I died. We all know we died. But we can't leave. We've been trapped down here since the basement was sealed. We can't find our way out. What do you want from me?" "We want someone to remember us. We want someone to know what happened to us down here, and we want our families to know where we are." Before I could respond, more figures appeared in the hallway behind Mary, men and women of various ages, all wearing hospital gowns from different eras, all with that same translucent appearance. "These are the other patients who live down here," Mary said. "We've been waiting for someone who could see us and hear us, someone who could help us." I looked at the faces of the patients gathered in the hallway. Despite their ghostly appearance, they looked like real people with real emotions and real needs. They looked lost, confused, and desperately hopeful that someone might finally be able to help them. "What happened to you down here?" I asked. Mary's expression grew sadder. "They put us down here because we were difficult, because we asked too many questions or caused problems upstairs. They said it was temporary, but most of us never left." "How did you die?" "Different ways. Some got sick and didn't get proper medical care. Some had accidents that maybe weren't accidents. Some just gave up. Stopped eating, stopped trying to get better." Another patient, a middle-aged man, stepped forward. "I'm Robert Davis. I died in 1974. I was supposed to be here for 6 months, but they kept me in the basement for 2 years. My family stopped visiting. They forgot about me. What can I do to help you?" I asked. Mary looked at the other patients, then back at me. "Tell people what happened down here. Make sure the families know where their loved ones are buried. Help us not be forgotten." Before I could ask any more questions, I heard voices calling my name from upstairs. Hospital security was looking for me, I had been in the basement for over 2 hours without anyone knowing where I was. "I have to go," I told Mary and the other patients. "But I'll help you. I'll make sure people know what happened here." Mary smiled, and for a moment she looked less translucent, more real. "Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. We've been waiting so long for someone to care." As I walked back toward the entrance to the historical wing, I turned around to look at the patients one more time. They were standing together in the hallway, watching me leave. They looked like a community of people who had taken care of each other in the absence of proper medical care or family support. When I reached the metal door that separated the historical wing from the modern basement, I looked back again. The hallway was empty. Over the next week, I researched the families of the patients who had died in the basement areas of Millbrook. Using death records, hospital archives, and genealogy databases, I was able to identify living relatives for 12 of the 18 deceased patients. I contacted these families and told them what I had learned about their relatives' deaths and burial locations. Most of the families had been told decades ago that their loved ones had died in the hospital, but none of them had been given specific information about where they were buried. Several families expressed interest in having their relatives' remains relocated to family burial sites. Others simply wanted to know more about what their loved ones had experienced during their time at Millbrook. But when I tried to share this information with Millbrook's administration, I encountered resistance. The hospital's CEO and chief medical officer told me that my research into historical patient records was outside the scope of my duties as a psychiatrist. They suggested that my interest in deceased patients was unhealthy and might be affecting my ability to treat living patients. I was ordered to stop contacting families of deceased patients and to focus exclusively on my current caseload, but I couldn't. Forget about Mary Johnson, Robert Davis, and the other patients I had encountered in the basement. And our current patients were still reporting voices from deceased patients who were asking for help. On February 8th, something happened that forced the hospital administration to take the situation seriously. During a routine fire safety inspection, inspectors discovered structural problems in the basement level that required immediate attention. When construction crews began working in the historical wing, they made a discovery that changed everything. Behind a wall that had been sealed during renovations in the 1980s, workers found a room that contained the personal belongings of dozens of former patients. Medical records, clothing, photographs, letters, and other items that should have been returned to families or properly disposed of when patients died. But more significantly, they found documentation that revealed the true extent of what had happened in the basement patient areas. Hidden among the patient belongings were incident reports, medical records, and staff notes that painted a picture of systematic neglect and abuse. Patients had been isolated in basement rooms for months or years at a time, with minimal medical care and virtually no contact with family members. Many patients had died from treatable medical conditions because they hadn't received proper care. Others had died from what appeared to be accidents, but were documented in staff notes as possible suicides or cases of self-harm that hadn't been prevented. The documentation also revealed that hospital administrators in the 1970s and 80s had been aware of the problems in the basement areas, but had chosen to cover them up rather than address them. When news of the discovery became public, it triggered investigations by state health authorities, law enforcement, and advocacy organizations for psychiatric patients. Within 2 weeks, Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital was ordered to cease operations and transfer all current patients to other facilities. But before the hospital closed, our patients reported one final communication from the voices they had been hearing. Margaret Patterson, the first patient to report voices from deceased patients, told me that Mary Johnson had spoken to her one last time. "She said to tell you, thank you," Margaret said. "She said the other patients are peaceful now because people finally know what happened to them. She said they can rest now." After Millbrook closed, I took a position at another psychiatric facility in Denver. But I've never forgotten about my experience with the patients who had been trapped in the basement of the old hospital. I believe that some people who die under traumatic or unjust circumstances may retain a form of consciousness that allows them to communicate with the living world. Especially with individuals who are sensitive to such communication, our psychiatric patients who were already experiencing altered states of consciousness due to their mental illness may have been uniquely able to receive communications from the deceased. Patients who had been forgotten and abandoned in the basement of Millbrook. The experience taught me that institutional care for vulnerable populations requires constant vigilance and advocacy. When patients are isolated from their families and communities, when their voices are not heard or believed, abuse and neglect can flourish in hidden places. But it also taught me that the human need for connection and remembrance may be so strong that it persists even after death. The patients who died in the basement of Millbrook had been forgotten by their families, abandoned by the mental health system, and erased from official records. Yet somehow, they found a way to make their voices heard again. They found a way to ensure that their stories would not be lost forever. And in the end, that may be the most important thing any of us can do. Make sure that the people who have been forgotten are remembered, and that the stories that have been hidden are finally told. These 5 encounters represent just a fraction of the documented cases involving hospital basement phenomena that occur across the country every year. What makes them significant isn't just their supernatural elements, it's what they reveal about the hidden histories of our medical institutions and the people who were forgotten within them. From Catherine Morrison, still waiting to go home after experimental treatments in the 1950s, to the children who never left their isolated basement ward, to the patients who died performing unfinished experimental surgeries, to those who were murdered and needed justice, to the psychiatric patients who were abandoned and forgotten. Each of these encounters represents someone whose story was never properly told. These aren't just ghost stories. They're testimonies from people who were failed by the medical system, who died without closure, who were denied dignity in their final moments. And somehow, through security cameras, through sensitive hospital staff, through the thin veil between life and death, they found a way to make their voices heard again. If you work in a hospital, especially during night shifts or in basement areas, I encourage you to pay attention to the unexplained phenomena around you. Equipment malfunctions, unusual sounds, and encounters that seem impossible might not be technical problems. They might be attempts at communication from people who desperately need to be heard. The hospital staff who shared these stories with me took enormous professional risks to bring these encounters to light. They knew that documenting supernatural phenomena could end their careers, but they felt a responsibility to the patients, both living and dead, who needed advocates. Before you go, make sure you're subscribed to After Dark Horrors and hit that notification bell. These stories don't come easy, and your support helps us continue investigating the encounters that other channels won't touch. Share this video with someone who can handle real horror, not the Hollywood kind, but the kind that happens in the places we trust most. If you have your own hospital encounter to share, you can reach us through the contact information in the description. We protect the identity of everyone who shares their story with us, and we take the time to verify documentation whenever possible. Next week, we're diving into something even more disturbing: authenticated encounters from nursing home night shifts across 5 different states. staff members, security footage, and incidents that aged care facilities definitely don't want public. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, the places we go for healing often carry the heaviest burdens from those who couldn't be healed. And sometimes, late at night, in the basement levels where the living rarely venture, those burdens become visible. Thanks for joining me in the dark. I'll see you next in the next story.